Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on European Union and response to coronavirus crisis. So the history of European Union in many ways in the past 10 years is about crisis. It has experienced Eurozone debt crisis between 2010 and 2015, so-called migration crisis between 2015, 2016, and then on the top of that came Brexit, as well as the rise of authoritarian or illiberal governments in Central and Eastern Europe. So pandemic in many ways creates an additional challenge to the European Union, which in many ways threatens even the survival of the EU. So in that respect, I think it's great that we have three panelists, three experts on the European Union who will share their opinions about how much of a challenge coronavirus is to the EU, what kind of measures the EU has taken so far, and how adequate are they to the challenges, especially in terms of economic recovery, and also what kind of challenges the EU will experience in responding to coronavirus crisis, particularly in terms of domestic opposition by political parties and public opinion. So our first panelist is Associate Professor Jonathan Polk, Associate Professor at the University of Copenhagen. Then welcome, John.
Thanks, Raimondas.
We have a second panelist, Dr. Andreas Hofmann, who is a researcher at Freie University Berlin.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And then finally, we have Associate Professor at the Department of Comparative Politics here at the University of Bergen, Adriana Bunea.
Hello, thank you for having me. And I apologize for turning on my video very, very soon, very quickly.
You are very enthusiastic about this
yes.
discussion. Well done. Great. So in the information that was sent about this event, I used a quote from Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez saying that the survival of the EU rests on response to coronavirus crisis. And he wrote an article in newspapers in 7 European countries saying that the EU really has to respond to coronavirus crisis through substantial economic recovery measures, particularly grants to the countries that had the most severe crisis, especially Spain and Italy. So let me start with the first question, and maybe John, you can start here. So how much do you agree with Mr. Sánchez that indeed pandemic is a fundamental challenge to the EU? How much does it threaten the survival of the EU?
I think it's a fundamental challenge to the European Union, but I don't see it necessarily as an existential crisis to the European Union as such. I do think there's a way in which it threatens what are fundamental values within the European Union. For example, freedom of movement, one of the 4 freedoms, we've seen that constrained rather substantially, and we've seen relatively uncoordinated acts on the parts of member state governments and how they go about doing these things. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that when you're dealing with a political organization like the European Union, where consensus is the norm, anytime you have prime ministers from particularly bigger member states like Spain and Italy saying that something is a fundamental challenge, we have to take them at their word when they say such things. And I think obviously we have to place the coronavirus crisis in the context of the broader EU challenges that you discussed in the introduction, coming on the heels of the 2010s and the North-South divisions that existed there, and the raw feelings in southern, more peripheral Eurozone economies about the EU's response. I think that exacerbates the challenges that face an entirely new leadership team in Brussels, right? Which is another important contextual piece of information here. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a member state leaving the European Union, which of course provides yet another blueprint for a potential relationship for the European Union outside of the EU. So when you put all of those things together, even though I'm a pretty strong believer that the EU will find a way to muddle through and carry on, I think it does still represent a fundamental challenge for what the European Union will be and what it will represent 20 years down the road from now.
Great. Andreas, maybe you could follow up on that?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree with John in that there are different aspects to this crisis that challenge the EU in different ways. For one, there's the immediate public health response, of course, and I think you can't really expect the EU to have much of a say in this particular issue. When you look at the situation in Germany, all of the public health responses were competences of the regions, the Länder, and there's been quite an uncoordinated response, even within a country like Germany. So you can't really expect the EU to be much more coordinated than that necessarily. Then the second question that comes on top of that, of course, is reconstruction. And once we get our economies running again, we need to do something about that. It will require a lot of money. And that's the next topic I think that we'll be talking about. But that, in a lot of ways, you can probably compare to the situation in the European Union after the external shock that came from the American property market exploding or imploding in 2008, 2009. So before the Euro crisis started, the financial crisis that brought the Great Recession to Europe at the time. And there too, in that situation, there wasn't a huge coordinated European response to that either. I think there's added value to what the EU can do, but it's not a genuine, it's an existential, how would you say? So it's not something that the EU is built to do. But of course, as John says, it builds on top of what's happened since, and in particular the North-South divide. And I think there's a real, there's an unfortunate aspect to this coronavirus in that it affects those countries that were hit hardest by the Euro crisis. In a disproportionate way, but that is not due to any of their fault. It's just sheer luck or bad luck in that particular sense. These countries like Spain and Italy, France to some extent maybe too, were hardest hit by the crisis. Or there are certain demographic factors and factors pertaining to the public health system in those countries that can explain these things, but there's no genuine fault, right? So the whole story that applied to the Euro crisis, the moralizing of those profligate Southern European countries, that doesn't work here so well. And I think that's also the opportunity now where there's much more space now for the Northern countries that were less affected by an external shock and that have made it through more easily. So it's for those, so the moralizing aspect is no longer valid in that particular circumstance. So it's much easier to be generous now. And I think that's also part of the reason why Merkel was so quick, if you wish. Well, it wasn't particularly quick, but so willing to invest a lot of German money into the recovery fund.
Great. Yeah, so I just want to get the opinions of all panelists on this fundamental question. So Adriana, I'll give you a floor as well. Do you think that this is an existential crisis for the EU?
I think it felt at certain points throughout the lockdown, as we were in our living rooms, behind our screens, the fact that suddenly we started to speak about national borders being unilaterally closed down, about countries being worried about the transport of food and the food chain from one country to another. I think that felt and was perceived as something that was existential for the EU, because as John said, this is a fundamental freedom. This is something that we take for granted when you are part of the European Union. And when that didn't happen, the free movement of people and goods, then I think that could have felt as an existential threat to what the EU is. But as Andreas said, a lot of the things that were happening and were a bit of a crisis, felt like a crisis situation, were not necessarily because of the EU, but because of some, contingencies and, things that were happening in particular national states because of the state of the health care system or, density of the population, urbanization, having a more urban, demographic makeup. But for a moment, and at certain moments in time when you felt that member states were making these unilateral decisions, I'm closing my borders with this, and that, then I think that was a fundamental existential threat. It felt, at least, and I think the response of the European Commission, the recent financial response, kind of hints at the fact that the coronavirus crisis might have been perceived as an important threat to the single market, which is like the heart of the European Union economic and political project. So in a way, the response of the European Commission tells us that this is something important. It might not be existential, and I hope it's not existential. And, you know, it's too much institution building behind this European Union to just, you know, dismantle it on the occasion of the first pandemic. But that's why Sánchez said what he said. And certainly from the Southern Europe, this was the view and this was the feeling. And to be left, you know, to feel locked down in your home as a citizen of Spain or Italy, I'm sure it wasn't very pleasant. And to look around and, you know, the first reactions on behalf of the EU were not the most encouraging.
Great. Yes. So thank you for all your opinions. So I take from this that this is not yet an existential crisis, but it is a big challenge to the EU. And there are several dimensions here. So free movement of persons and goods, just the public health dimension itself, and also the economic recovery dimension, which we will focus on for most of our remaining discussion. Just to remind to the listeners that you can ask questions, which is something that I should have mentioned in the beginning of my introduction. You can ask questions on Q&A function on Zoom, and also you can make comments in the YouTube, which will then be provided to us by the moderators of the discussion. So yes, so thinking about these economic recovery measures, I guess the fundamental challenge is that not all member states have equal fiscal capacity to support their business and workers. And we've seen that, for example, Germany has provided very substantial state aid to its companies, much more so than, for example, Italy or Spain, just because Germany has sounder public finances and more capacity to do so. So in that sense, it seems that the EU is really important in responding economically to the crisis. And we know that so far the EU has adopted several measures, right? We've seen measures from European Central Bank, so buying liquidity of the governments and private companies in the EU. We also seen 540 billion package adopted in April, which includes loans from the European Stability Mechanism, the Eurozone's bailout funds. And more recently, we saw that the Commission has made a proposal for a 750 billion bailout package, which comes on the heels of the common French-German position. And one important aspect of this bailout package is that most affected member states, or all member states, but in particular the ones that were most affected by the crisis, will be able to receive grants from the European Union. So what do you think about these measures? Are they helpful? Do you think that they are a sufficient response to the economic dimension of the crisis? And also, do you think that this is a so-called Hamiltonian moment of the EU, where we finally get not only monetary union, so common currency used by most EU member states, but also fiscal union, so the financial redistribution between member states that goes beyond a very limited current EU budget, which is 1% of EU GDP. So maybe Andreas, you can take up this question.
Sure. So, well, there are two parts of the question, right? So the first is it helpful? Is it sufficient? Well, it's definitely helpful. Whether it's sufficient will remain to be seen. I think one of the most important things for the EU to do at the moment is not to make matters worse, for one, which is by insisting on austerity measures to still left in place. So a lot of the measures that were especially imposed on other European states in order to get their public finances in order need to be lifted at this stage. And part of the, if you wish, rage from countries like Italy and Spain towards the EU in this situation was that part of the reason that they are in dire straits when it comes to their public finances was due to the euro crisis, and there's a lot of sort of endogenous causes of that. So the euro itself was part of the reason for the euro crisis. So that they now felt that if the EU can't help us now, then what is it for? So I think one of the rationales in being fairly generous in granting these relief grants, many of them will be grants, not just loans, is making up, I guess, for the hardship that Southern Europe has gone through. Is it a Hamiltonian moment? It's definitely a precedent. So I think it will make it easier looking into the future, if it works, right? If it works. It will make it easier looking into the future in similar types of situations where emergency response is necessary. It's required that the EU will be looked upon as one of those, one of the potential sources for massive amounts of funding. The European Central Bank will be central to this too. It was central in the Euro crisis, it will be central to this too, providing free money. But that comes with its own problems, and I think we will talk about the German legal position on these types of things a little bit later on in the seminar. So that comes with its own problems. But I think for now, the signs are very positive. The EU has managed not to make matters worse, and it looks like it will be of some use, in particular to the hardest hit countries, Italy and Spain.
Yeah, John, would you like to follow up on that?
Yeah, I was particularly pleased to hear Andy touching on the role of austerity and the depletion of the public healthcare systems in some of the countries that were hardest hit by the Eurozone. I think that's an important point to make. I share his ambivalence or uncertainty as to whether it's enough. And I also agree that it is helpful. I think it's important to note that although this the MFF proposal that came from the Commission most recently is higher than what the European Council President Michel was looking for in his compromise position, it's in fact lower than what the Commission was proposing at the outset of the coronavirus crisis. So it's not as if this 1.1 trillion is such an amazingly large move in and of itself. And so at that point, so much hinges on the recovery fund. And I think one of the more interesting things that we'll probably talk about in the course of this is whether bundling that recovery fund within the multi-annual funding framework was a good or bad thing. I mean, it has its advantages, it has its disadvantages, but one of the main challenges for it is that it's subject to ongoing negotiations, right? And so it will be interesting to see what the ratio of grants to loans ends up looking at once the bargaining has all taken place. And I think that will do a lot to talk about whether or not it's a sufficient amount. The other thing is, as you mentioned before, right, the coalition parties in Germany are meeting today to discuss an 80 billion euro stimulus fund there. I think a lot will depend on what the member states themselves are able to do to supplement and do these things. And obviously that's going to vary a lot as far as capacity. I guess my central concern about what's been done up to this point and to whether or not it's adequate is I think under most timelines I've seen discussed, kicks in as of 1 January 2021, right? How do we get from there to here, right? There's some rather acute suffering going on right now. And what's been put forward so far is either to some degree still contingent on the ESM, right, which has a lot of negative connotations, particularly in the countries that are most affected, as well as the European Central Bank's purchasing program, which, as Andy's going to talk about a little bit more later, I think is on increasingly shaky legal footing, right, or will likely be challenged in a way that it hasn't been up till now. And so I am interested in seeing how things go in terms of the need for there to be the kind of log rolling and bargaining that we know takes place within the European Council negotiations, and the need for speedy responses as it relates to this. And as far as how that relates to the Hamiltonian moment, I think a lot of that depends on to what extent the EU countries agree to new revenue streams, right? These own resources for the Commission that have been proposed there, which is also subject to the bargaining. And so it's hard to say without having seen what the final package ends up looking like, what degree it is. But I think it's kind of the kind of stereotypically neo-functionalist blueprint for how you would go about doing such a thing, right? You say this is a one-off, it's only going to be this time. Nevertheless, you establish the precedent that can potentially lead to the kind of spillover that brings about the more substantial fiscal union down the road. At the same time, I thought that was likely to happen with Spitzenkandidaten, right? And the brakes have been pumped on that. So it's not as if the neo-functionalist logic is inevitable, right? And so it'll be interesting to see that tension play out and the negotiations coming up in the next few months here.
Yeah, great response. So just to remind to the readers that the Commission has made a proposal for this bailout, for these economic measures, and the decision has to be taken by the European Council, which includes heads of government and states from each member state. So we need unanimous support of all member states for this proposal to be adopted. And of course, as both Andreas and John have been saying, there may be a lot of changes to the proposed measures. So since we have this demand for unanimous agreement among member states, where would you see most resistance? And maybe Andreas, I will ask you again to comment about this point on the German Constitutional Court's decision that has caused some controversy recently. So do you think that Germany is really shifting its position towards greater fiscal union in the European Union, and how they can do that given that decision? So maybe you can also summarize the decision that has been.
Sure, yeah. So as many of you will know, the German Constitutional Court about a month ago went and disqualified the European Central Bank's action in its program quantitative easing, one of the primary response measures to the euro crisis. A couple of things I think that need to be highlighted here. First of all, it was an action directed against the European Central Bank. Technically, it was an action against the German government for not doing enough to stop the European Central Bank from doing this, but that's really just a technicality. There was nothing the German government could have done. With most of the other measures that were taken by the German government in responding to the euro crisis, they were all challenged before the German Constitutional Court, and they were all waved through. So they were all green lighted. So I don't think in that sense the German government will be severely restrained in its response capacity. What has happened is, so the German government went and nullified or now has prevented the German Bundesbank from participating in further quantitative easing measures. In a lot of ways, I think it's a very sort of unfortunate judgment. It comes with unfortunate timing and a surprising lack of political finesse. But I think it's first and foremost kind of a German exercise in legal navel gazing without a lot of circumspection around it. So what it has done is the German Constitutional Court has said that the European Central Bank failed to properly perform a proportionality test in setting up its quantitative easing program. It failed to properly weigh monetary policy goals against economic consequences. And one of the examples the German Constitutional Court here used was to say one of the consequences of the quantitative easing program was zero interest rates, so 0% interest rates. And what does that mean for German savers? For German savers, it meant pouring their money into real estate and leading to real estate bubbles in German metropolitan areas. So that's, I guess, the backdrop of where the discontent comes from. And really, the only thing it's told the European Central Bank is that next time you do this, you need to do your proportionality test much more thoroughly, and your justification needs to be public. That's really all it says in substance. Insofar, it applies some pressures on all actors involved, but it shouldn't be too hard for the European Central Bank to respond to this. And now, the judgment, by the way, was pretty much agreed upon before this whole Corona crisis started. It's been delayed for a couple of months while I guess the judges went back and double checked whether it had any consequences for real world activities in a live sort of sense. And they in their press release that came with the judgment, they specifically highlighted that it in no way affects the Corona program. That's a different question that wasn't at issue. And you would also think that the central bank would be able to operate within the legal limits set by the German Constitutional Court. The other thing, though, that is more problematic is that there was also a judgment by the European Court of Justice on the same issue. In fact, there had been a referral from the German Constitutional Court to the European Court, and the European Court found no fault with the actions of the European Central Bank. It said, so these actions are completely within its mandate. and referred the question back to the German Constitutional Court, and the German Constitutional Court decided that the reasoning of the European Court of Justice was faulty, and the judgment should therefore be ignored. And that of course, is a much more groundbreaking decision in a way. It's I think the third decision of a high national court to specifically or explicitly ignore a judgment by the European Court of Justice. There was a judgment in the Czech Republic, which was about the Mangold ruling, as far as I remember. No, actually, that was the one in Denmark. So the Danish Constitutional Court, not the Danish Constitutional Court, but the Danish High Court also chose to explicitly set aside a European Court of Justice ruling. And now the German court has done the same thing. And that, of course, has much more grave consequences on what other courts will be next in setting aside a judgment by the European Court of Justice. And the prime suspects, of course, are the constitutional courts of Poland and Hungary that are no longer independent and are stacked with government stooges, if you wish. And they can use this as a blueprint to now proceed to invalidate or to simply ignore all judgments that come from Luxembourg.
Great.
I would say that that's the more existential crisis the EU faces right now than anything else.
But in terms of the coronavirus response, I think the ramifications will be quite negligible.
Yeah, thanks for the great answer. Since we already started speaking about political parties and populist governments in Poland and Hungary that are formed by right-wing populist parties, it may be a good occasion for John to provide some information about the most recent wave of the Chapel Hill expert survey on parties' positions that just came out and has lots of interesting information about positions of national parties in Europe on the European integration, but also a number of other issues. Mm-hmm. So yeah, John, maybe you can share some insights from these recent data sets, and maybe you have some insights about how much opposition Eurosceptic parties and Eurosceptic publics in the EU can create to EU economic recovery measures.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. As you mentioned, this is a new wave of the Chapel Hill Expert Survey on Party Positioning in Europe, which connects with 6 previous waves going back to 1999. So we now have the capacity to look at party positioning on European integration and a variety of other ideological components over a 20-year period, which is a nice dynamic time period of EU history. We've only had the data ourselves relatively recently. It was released yesterday for public consumption. And we, in our preliminary analysis, focused on party positions towards European integration because that's the core of the survey. And a few of our initial findings are that between 2014, which is the last date of our survey, and 2019, at the top level across all EU member states, there's been very little change. The average position in 2014 was around a 5 on a 1 to 7 scale, where 7 is support for the EU. And in 2019, it's more or less indistinguishable statistically speaking. But when we look under the hood and start looking at some party characteristics, we found that parties that were new to our data set in 2019, so that were not included in the 2014 wave, are almost a full point less in favor of European integration than the older parties. This is not wildly surprising given what we know about newer parties and their tendency, at least in Western Europe, to be what political scientists Sarah Hobalt and Catherine van der Vries have called challenger parties, parties that attempt to mobilize support and public opinion on dimensions of political competition that are usually orthogonal to kind of left-right competition, and that up till now haven't been all that politicized. And one of the prime areas that they can try to do this is European integration, because amongst the mainstream parties, there's generally a kind of de facto support for the EU, but also a pretty strong desire not to make it a topic of much conversation, because there is a discrepancy between where political elites stand on European integration and where the broader public stands on European integration, with elites generally being more in favor of the EU than are publics. So from the perspective of constraints on coronavirus responses from the EU, it's the desire of these so-called challenger parties to upend the status quo and to politicize European integration that can be a real problem, potentially, for the mainstream parties and for the European Union as such. It's compounded by the difficulty of finding a solution from the European Union's perspective that can satisfy the challenger threats in the north and the challenger threats in the south, which are of fundamentally different ideological types, right? For the most part in the north, you have challenger parties that are concerned with national sovereignty, more traditional authoritarian nationalists, and want to kind of claw back their rights and responsibilities from the European Union, the ones that would be more advocating exit from the EU with the Brexit party or something along these lines in the UK. In the South, on the other hand, you'll frequently find challenger parties that in fact want to see more in the way of fiscal integration, like Podemos in Spain or Syriza in Greece in 2015 and so on. And so finding a way to square that circle is quite difficult for the EU. The last finding we have is that in Central and Eastern Europe, the relationship between new parties and relatively anti-EU stances is not as strong. And I think this is in large part in a function to opposition to incumbent governments that are to some degree flaunting fundamental values of the European Union and kind of thumbing their nose at ECJ rulings and things along these lines. So a kind of pro-EU position for the opposition is something that can be quite useful for them in distinguishing themselves from incumbents that, while they're not proponents of leaving the EU because they like the EU money and various other things that come with it, they are more reticent about what they see as this cosmopolitan project of European integration. So that's what we've got for 2019. And I can't remember if there was any other component to your question that you wanted me to touch on.
No, I think you addressed my question perfectly well. And I should remind the readers that chess team, which John is part of, are going to run a flash survey of this expert survey looking at parties' positions on specific measures adopted during the coronavirus crisis. So I don't know, John, did you want to advertise that a bit?
Sure, yeah, I would. We want to be careful because we've already taxed our experts quite substantially this year with our normal survey. And so the hope is to keep it relatively tightly contained with at most 5 questions. And at the moment, we're toying with a question that forces some sort of analysis of the trade-offs between economic recovery and public health, if those things could be prioritized in different ways by party positions. One that specifically addresses the use of concentration of executive authority as a response to the coronavirus. Here, we're thinking to some degree of Hungary, right, and the emergency rule decree that was put into place there. But obviously, this isn't restricted to the Hungarian case. It took place in France as well. And then we're going to be doing surveys in Latin America where this question is of increasing importance for those countries as well. So it'll be nice to have some comparative data on that. We want to find something that would be a good instrument to get at this question of North-South divisions as it relates to fiscal union, but we also want to find a way of asking the question that doesn't necessarily just reproduce where the parties stand on European integration as such. So the tension for us on this third question is getting so specific about what we ask, some aspect of, say, the ratio of grants to loans in the Commission's proposal, that we increasingly find it hard to find experts that are going to have knowledge about party positions on this, if the parties are even taking positions on this, as opposed to a question that's so macro that we essentially just end up reproducing the European integration scale. And then the other question that we've got at the moment that we're interested in is whether or not the parties believe citizens can be trusted to follow social distancing measures through their own responsibility, or does it require a strong government hand to come in and impose these things from on high? So that's at least what we've been thinking about up to this point. As you and I have corresponded, and Andy as well, there's some, I guess, skepticism on our part as to whether we're going to find a lot of party level differences in these. But I think that in and of itself could be a potentially interesting finding, in that there's a debate within the party politics literature about the extent to which European integration and things like the EU's response to the coronavirus has penetrated domestic politics. Or is this still at its core foreign policy, where governments have been ceded the authority and the autonomy to negotiate these things from the perspective of the member states as such, right? And that party competition isn't really happening as much on these issues. So it'll be, for us, I think, an interesting exploration to find out whether we see any traction to this idea of EU politics and the coronavirus response in particular getting into domestic political competition, or is this still something that's more of a foreign policy brief?
Definitely. Yeah, so I just want to remind the readers that if you have any suggestions on what kind of questions chess team should be asking, please do so. Please provide them using Q&A function here on Zoom, and also YouTube comments. And please ask questions as well. Since we don't have so many questions at this stage, I think we can just continue our discussion. We do have a question from one of the panelists. Well, yes, Adriana, please. You have been silent for a while.
Yes, I've been listening to party politics scholars who provided us with a fantastic overview of the challenges that the EU and member states will be facing in terms of big politics regarding the adoption of these, financial measures and the Hamiltonian moment, and dealing with court decisions and national courts' reactions to the European Court of Justice decisions. So we were discussing until now the big politics perspective, right? And I think both Andreas and John did a wonderful job in kind of mapping out the challenges that will come in the next period, in the next 6 months of the year, from this perspective. And in addition to this big politics picture, there is also the law, policy making, impact assessments, evidence-based policy making that is happening in Brussels, and that is also playing a role in the extent to which funds are made available based on certain conditionality, the way in which the funds will be accessed or not by member states, the ease with which they will be accessed. And at the beginning, you asked the question, is this enough? We know that the European Commission is this technocratic, evidence-based policymaker that, makes decisions based on impact assessments. So theoretically, their funds were informed by some sort of, feasibility and, cost-benefit analysis, in addition to all the political thinking and the political cost-benefit analysis that both Andreas and John were talking about. And in the same time, in terms of this Hamiltonian moment, we shouldn't forget that, as John pointed out at some point in his answer to your first question, this neo-functionalist logic also applies, if we look at this, from a budgetary policy perspective or a financial policy perspective, this is one tiny moment that builds on other tiny moments that come together in, small patches that are knitted nicely together and push forward European integration in one particular policy area. John also mentioned the initiative and the experiment of the Spitzenkandidat, but that was a political initiative fundamentally and essentially and crucially and unidimensionally, whereas this one has policy implications in a manner in which the European Commission knows how to deal with it in a smart manner, in which to kind of make it a strong precedent and to add it up on top of the already existing measures. But this also means that the European Commission also faces the challenge of the very practical policymaking side of adopting this financial budgetary measures, financial stimulus, which will make the story of the adoption and the bargaining and the negotiations between member states even more interesting in the next 6 months.
Yes.
Could I ask a follow-up question to Adriana? I think that's a really important point, and I was struck by an interview I read with Gentilini, with the economics commissioner, who suggested that the impact assessment in particular is one of the really groundbreaking aspects of the proposal, and that they seem to think that they have a very solid foundation for the numbers that they've come up with, as you suggested there. I was interested in your thoughts, as somebody that knows a lot about the Commission and the bureaucracy in particular, about the position of von der Leyen within the Commission more broadly. And I guess to some extent to tie it to this other discussion we were having about the political discussion of Spitzenkandidat, and then the fact that she did not emerge from the Spitzenkandidaten process. Do you think of her as being in a particularly strong or weak position vis-a-vis the other institutions or any other aspect of the Commission bureaucracy because of it being early in her term and the relatively weak political mandate that she has? And not coming out of something that could have this more direct tie to democratic procedures or something along these lines?
So her position in relation to, we have to other DGs, she's strong. There has been a presidentialization of the Commission. It's all good there. But you're right that she misses this sort of input legitimacy for her mandate that would have come following a Spitzenkandidaten process being put in place. On the other hand, we should think that, in terms of crisis, maybe we decide to apply different, we might have different feelings or of urgency about which type of legitimacy we suddenly care about at EU level. And at this point, in the last 5 years, it was all about input and throughput legitimacy. We really wanted for the European Commission to show the world that they are consulting with others and there is a participatory policy-making process and it's transparent and they listen to all affected parties, because this output legitimacy was no longer, enough for them, right? And the manner in which Juncker was elected was part of that effort to ensure input legitimacy for the Commission. And then the Commission tried to use various ways in actually using this to amplify its power and legitimacy, better regulation measures, you name it, institution building, you name it. And now out of a sudden, all the measures that the European Commission is kind of adopting are exclusively focused on it trying to increase its output legitimacy. So in a way, it went back to its initial strength. It knows now, and I guess the president of the European Commission knows that it has to kind of, that maybe, the competitive advantage of the European Commission, at least in this particular crisis, is to make sure that the European Commission can tackle climate change, Digital Services Act and the regulation of digital services and the big tech and so on and so forth. And now is able to provide, the financial stimulus and the financial support that the EU needs to go over this. So I think this shift in how the European Commission tries to build a new type of legitimacy and tries to position itself within, the institutional setup of the EU, it's quite interesting. And the European Commission has the European Commission has always been there. The governments of member states have changed. Parties have been in and out of government, so to say, but the European Commission has this advantage of knowing how to play the medium to long-term game. And it knows, it has an informational advantage of what's happening in terms of Brussels and coordinating the member states and coordinating with the member states and getting information from them. The only input legitimacy move that I could see until now was that President von der Leyen said, okay, so we are going to give loans and grants based on some decisions that are going to be made in comitology, and national member states will also be part of this, obviously, of these comitology committees. And member states are going to have to present some national plans in which they are going to tell us how they are going to use the money to reconstruct their economies in line with the European priorities. So that was the only, that was obviously a measure in which the Commission tried to legitimize the decision-making, so sort of input and throughput type of legitimacy for its decisions on how to give money to member states. But I would say that, yeah, so perhaps it's because of this perceived vulnerability and lack of legitimacy in this particular moment that the European Commission tries to, yes, to increase von Leyen's authority and legitimacy in relation to other key institutional actors. But you are right, it's an excellent question.
We had Andreas also asking for a chance to give his opinion. Please do so.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the suggestion that there might actually be a strength in von der Leyen not being one of the Spitzenkandidaten. I think we do forget who the Spitzenkandidaten were, and if it had been one of them, if it had been Weber or Timmermans, then I think that president would have been in a much more difficult situation trying to get through the Commission proposals that are on the table now. Weber would have had a difficult position with Macron. They didn't get along. And Timmermans would have been unacceptable to the Eastern Europeans, who we now rely on. We need Orban's agreement to pass any kind of budgetary measure. So I think the fact that von der Leyen is acceptable to all heads of state and government in Europe is a distinct advantage over the alternatives that would have been on the table.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, very interesting discussion about the role of a commission. But since you, Andreas, mentioned Eastern Europe, let's try to think about that a bit. And John, you mentioned this big tension between North and South, how different Eurosceptic parties have different positions on coronavirus crisis. But of course, as you, Andreas, are saying, the decision has to be unanimous. So there has to be support of Hungary and Poland for any measures, any economic recovery measures adopted in the European Council that includes grants to member states. So I guess my question is then how much the EU can do about democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland. So we have a situation where we need their support for any decisions made in the European Council, but at the same time, of course, the EU has a strong interest in preventing further backsliding, democratic backsliding in these countries, and potentially bringing them back on democratic path. So I'm not sure which one of you would be. Yes, John, please go ahead. What's your opinion?
I think it just actually connects rather cleanly with what we've been discussing up to this point, and I think it's the chief challenge of the binding of the recovery fund and the MFF. Right, is this need for unanimity. But jumping back to the point about who are the potential brakemen on this deal as it exists, at least according to what we see in media discussion about it, it's this so-called frugal four, right, of Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, Austria, and at least particularly in Scandinavia, you are increasingly hearing concerns about democratic backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe, and a really strong desire to find ways to at least import some aspect of conditionality about EU funding as it relates to standing up for fundamental values. Doing that within the MFF seems almost impossible to me, as I understand the way this negotiation plays out, and you just discussed it. But I would be particularly interested in hearing about what Adriana was talking about before, right? The comitology and the possibility of tying some of these extra fund components of things to support for rule of law and minority rights, things along these lines. And I think that finding some way to address this successfully is particularly important for the Commission, because as you were mentioning at the outset about whether this was enough, the initial action from the Commission, right, was to spend some of that cohesion money that was left over from the last MFF, but it still had to be done according to the allocation framework there. And so the bulk of it goes to Hungary and Poland, relatively unaffected by the crisis, as they're currently backsliding, right? I mean, the optics of that couldn't possibly be any worse, right? And so assuming people pay any attention to that whatsoever, there has to be a way in which the EU finds some means of dealing with this. And I think what Adriana was talking about before seems to me to be the most fruitful avenue potentially, but like to hear more on that.
Yes. So, yeah, Andreas, please.
It struck me reading through the Commission proposal, or actually reading about the Commission proposal. I haven't actually read the actual document, but one of the things that seemed evident was that similar to the measures taken in the context of the Eurozone crisis, in devising the measures, the Commission was fairly sidelined, but in implementing the measures, the Commission is front and center. And it seemed to me that in the way that the Commission is now trying to tie in all of these aid, these loans and grants into the European semester, and giving itself the power to express country-specific recommendations, I think in bypassing the European Council in these particular circumstances, I think that is in a way leaving the back door open for the Commission to then express some sort of conditionality through these country-specific recommendations when it comes to setting up these recovery plans that are a requirement for accessing these funds.
Okay, so you believe that Hungary and Poland can essentially be tricked into accepting that proposal from the Commission, and then finding themselves that they're constrained by all the comitology procedures later on.
It won't be as clear cut as clear conditionality would be from the outset, but at least it leaves some room of maneuver to the Commission in order to steer this whole thing in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point. Well, I mean, we spoke about Hungary and Poland as sort of two countries in Central and Eastern Europe, but of course, these are not the only countries. And I'm coming from Lithuania, and I know that Baltic states have a rather different position there in the sense that we probably will just wait and see. And as long as the cohesion and agricultural funds that we have been receiving so far are not too affected by this whole process, we will be happy to go along with any solidarity measures that the EU will be adopting. Adriana is from Romania, another country in the region. Maybe you could share some insights about the Romanian position on these economic recovery measures, and also the link to democratic conditionality in these measures.
Yes. So Romanians are definitely pro-Europeans. So the population, the average Romanian voter would support anything that comes from the EU. They think it's all good. The problem is with the political elites and their ability to actually access the funds, use the funds appropriately. And then the fear that the European Prosecutor's Office is going to knock at their door. She is also Romanian, the head of the European Prosecutor's Office. So she has a bit of experience with managing her connationals. And I've seen a declaration made by the Romanian Prime Minister on Sunday evening, in which he made a very relaxed, casual statement about this stimulus. And he said, well, let's see, we'll try to prepare some plans to access this European money, but let's see what we can use them for. And this is, let's say, one of the most progressive governments that the Romania can have in this period of time. This is possibly the most pro-European government. This is a government that is most likely to actually support some conditionality, attaching conditionality to funding towards countries such as Poland or Hungary, but has its own conditionality to kind of, respond to, right? So there, in my view, there are different forms of democratic backsliding. There are the obvious ones that are happening in Poland and Hungary. And then there are the more subtle ones that are happening in a country like Romania, where, you have endemic corruption and, mismanagement of European funds. And that's also a form of democratic backsliding, in the sense of, bad governance, mismanagement of public funds. So in that case, keeping an eye on Romania is interesting because it has very mixed incentives on how to position itself relative to other Eastern European and relative to the Western European countries. The big problem for Romania is that these funds, are also, they come up not only with the democratic conditionality, but also with the progressive economic planning and restructuring of the economy conditionality attached to it. the European Commission said, okay, we are going to give you, we give money, but you have to restructure your economy so that it's aligned with the Green Deal and the future Digital Services Act. So it says to a country like Romania, you can use this money as long as you bring your economy in the 21st century and you are aligned with our 21st century goals, you know, artificial intelligence, you name it. Whereas Romania is still using money to build infrastructure and tries to build highways. And it tries to develop an economy that is fundamentally rooted in 20th century still. So the money are there, but the extent to which Romania is going to be able to actually make a strong case for saying, okay, we need this money because we have this, super green economic recovery plan under our belt or in our, national plans, it's a different question. So some countries, in Eastern Europe, they would have money available, but the extent to which they will be able to access them because of how their economy looks like and their priorities look like, or because of their absorption capacity, it's a different matter.
Yeah.
So, and this, the European Commission will face a some difficult choices to make there. How do you deal with these situations in which, certain Eastern European countries might not be able to meet your criteria for actually getting access to the money?
State capacity still remains a huge problem in
the structure of the economy.
Yeah, structure of the economy. So we only have a couple minutes left, and it seems like we failed to inspire too many questions. But we haven't spoken much about Brexit, and of course that's still something that is going on. So maybe as a concluding point, we can briefly discuss that. I'm not sure who would like to pick up this point and say something about how much we would expect for Brexit process to be affected by coronavirus crisis. Do we expect that a closer relationship between the EU and UK will emerge, or on the other hand, we may have a breakdown of the relationship? Yes, I think John.
Yeah, I don't mind starting things off, but I guess
we only have a couple of minutes left.
Yep,
so
my central concern, I'll keep it quite brief, is that both sides will be distracted, right? There's only so much decision-making capacity that's out there and negotiation capacity that can be taking place. And when both the European Union and the United Kingdom necessarily have to focus so much of their energies and times and resources on the coronavirus, just worry about the brief moving one notch lower on the priority stack, and therefore becoming that much more likely that some suboptimal outcome will come around, particularly given that it hasn't been the most fruitful negotiation up to this point.
Yeah.
So further delay is quite likely.
Yeah. One interesting aspect is that both leaders of that process, both Johnson and Barnier, both had coronavirus.
We know what they're doing.
And I think that the EU will be thinking, okay, which one of these two events, Brexit and the pandemic, poses a greater threat to the single European market? Let's not forget that this is about the single market, and then the European Commission is going to allocate its limited resources, as John said, negotiating resources or analytical resources, depending on the answer to this question, which one is a bigger threat. And so
it's another difficult balancing act for the Commission, because on the one hand, it certainly doesn't want to do anything that jeopardizes economic prospects and recovery and growth and things along these lines. But on the other hand, it has a very strong interest in making sure that the post-EU relationship between the United Kingdom and the EU can't be too good, right? I mean, it just can't be a la carte access to financial services to the common market and whatnot, or else that just makes it a much too attractive proposition to other recalcitrant member states. So it's again a very narrow shoot to channel.
Great. So I think we're right on time for concluding this webinar. So thank you so much for interesting points, and I think I covered everything that I did want to cover, so that's great. I hope the audience found this interesting and illuminating about the current EU affairs. So I think I will let the moderators to take over from here. I suppose we can just finish the meeting.
Thank you for your invitation, Raimondas, and thank you, John
Yes.
and Andreas, for joining us virtually in Bergen, where we have sun.
Wonderful to see you all.
Thank you very much.
We look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Hoping for the best.
Bye.
Great.
Bye.